as we're all here now, and people may join us, and we always have this kind of experience of people dropping in and sometimes having to drop out. So, for instance, my brother won't be joining us till about 11:30 because he's on a call with the Green Party right now. So, so I'm gonna kick off if that's okay, or ask Ian to start, and we'll move into our 10-minute introduction. I apologize sincerely to those of you who've heard this about 4 million times, but we do feel it's important to give a bit of context to our events, so that they don't appear to have come out of absolutely nowhere. So I'm going to put on to slideshow and ask Ian to start us off. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Sharon. And as I say, it's great to see everybody. And I think that what we have today is a combination of people who've joined us at our events that began in the spring of 2021. It's great to see people who are coming back and joining us today, and their wisdom and experience is very valuable. And also that people who are new today. So I'd like to welcome friends and colleagues who are joining us, particularly from Wales, who are joining us today. And this, as everybody knows, is the focus for today's event. So this is the second of the events of 2025. The title at the bottom of that slide there, which is around memories and contemporary practice in Wales, is the thread that runs through all that we're doing today. Some of you, majority of you have met me before, but those who haven't, so I'm the person who's been sending you lots of emails with links, and it's great to see everybody. I'm recently retired from paid work, and up until June of this year, I had a great pleasure of working part-time at Trinity St David's in Swansea on their doctorate programs. So that's enough about me. The next slide, Sharon, in terms of our collaborative work, as we've got here, I think that the thing to emphasize is that we have people from Scotland, different parts of England, Wales and France in terms of that local, national and international perspective. So I think that that's what we really want to kind of emphasize. There's something here that will come through the presentations, which is about the interrelationships between the local, the national and the international. And I think perhaps that is one of the threads. We've got, as we have in our events, a combination of short presentations and space for discussion and reflection. And at the end of today, we'll also talk about what next, because we have an idea of a third event at the end of 2025. So the next slide, Sharon, do you think? Sharon, for you, because you were one of the commissioners along with CILLA, do you want to just give that? It's right that you give this context now, where we've come from. So particularly for people new to our research circle, it's to understand the links between our current work and work that historically and the contemporary work that CILLA, Sharon and Nick were involved with.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ian. So back in 2019, we produced the Centenary Commission on Adult Education Centenary Report, a Permanent National Necessity, which looked at adult education and lifelong learning for 21st century Britain and was a reflection on the Adult Education Committee final report of 1919. So it looked at the contemporary challenges to adult education, and a group of us were involved as commissioners, in probably around 20 of us from different agencies and organisations, with a view to trying to find ways of promoting and developing new perspectives and new approaches to promoting adult education and democracy in the broadest sense in 2019. It was a difficult report to write. There's quite a lot of kind of complexities behind the scenes in terms of ensuring that we had user voice, and Nick and myself and CILLA were actively involved in that in terms of interviewing community and user organizations. And we felt that was important, that that was central in the report itself. And I think we did that ultimately fairly well. As a result of that, the report didn't have the traction that we really wanted it to at the time. If people remember, it came out in November 2019, and it was just before the general election, and or around the time of the general election, and I remember a lot of us feeling that we had lost a lot of traction quite quickly. It was buried fairly rapidly amidst everything else that occurred at that particular time politically. Nevertheless, a group of us carried on in the form of Adult Education 100, a campaign group, including the secretaries for the 2019 report, John Holford and Jonathan Mickey, a number of us who had been commissioners, um, Ian and others who'd been involved in various elements of the report writing. And we have continued to this day, to the point that we had a meeting last week to look at new ways of reigniting issues around adult education, particularly in its broadest conception, at a time when adult education is being pretty much buried within a national context and actually internationally. So we feel it's more timely than ever. These spaces that we've developed, and I'll say a bit more about that, have been something that we've been evolving since 2020, when we had a meeting as organised by the Centenary Commission and the Cooperative College at the time, looking at the development of research circles to take forward work, actions, some of the energy of the report, and formulate practice as a result of the report. And our events started really with that launch of the research circle event. The one research circle that took off is this one, which was based on one of the chapters in the report around fostering community democracy and dialogue. And we started with an initial round of meetings. Some of the people on this call, like Lyndon and others, have been involved actively right from the start. And a group of us have basically continued to keep the smaller research circle that organises these events going, with particular thanks to Ian, who does much of the facilitation and coordination work. In January to March, we started with our research project, which was a piece of work that Ian was very involved in. And from May, July, and September 2021, we had our first series of research circle events, which focused on resources for a journey of hope, which is a key phrase from Raymond Williams' own work towards 2000, which was incredibly important to us at the time, trying to find a space to talk about emancipatory forms, more radical forms of adult education at a time when we felt that that voice was being squeezed out in an increasingly neoliberal context, where adult education was being reconfigured continually as learning for work, and that alone. And the second series took us into democracies in crisis. We looked at issues around social and health inequalities, educational inequalities, and we've always had some and attracted some great speakers. And we've always, as you know, thus far been online as well. So we've tried to include an international flavour and an international audience. Our third and fourth series is in 2023 and 2024. We looked at learning communities in 2023, particularly through the lens of some of the developments around learning cities and how you build a dialogical learning community, democracy, sorry, at community level. And we looked at global and local issues in that context. Last year, took a more historical lens. We looked backwards. We looked at, for example, work around the imagination, and engaged with issues around reflecting on the work of minors education, for example. But we very much took a perspective that we were looking backwards in order to influence the present and particularly the future. So we've always been looking forwards as well as backwards to really kind of guide our work and learn from the past. And Ian and I came up with a phrase, I think it was probably Ian who came up with it, of willful remembering, which is something that I continually think about in the context of this group and of our work around the research circles, that it's a political act of remembering before it's too late, and much of our enormous archive of experience and research and energy is kind of lost or buried. So this is very important, we feel. I'm just going to move on. So we do engage with a range of audiences. Ian and I have been involved at a couple of the Cwmni and Yule events. Those, for those who don't know them, they're events that focus from a research perspective on adult education, if you like, amongst the academic sphere in particular, as well as practitioners. But we were also engaged in the TUC Midlands Festival last year, looking at learners, learning workers' education and the place of the research circle. And we had our first event that Ian's already mentioned in May this year, which looked at spaces and places of diverse arts, the cultural imagination in life-wide and dialogical learning. And we looked in particular at that point at the contemporary and historical potteries, so it's a focus on Stoke-on-Trent, at which Lyndon spoke, and we offered a case study in relation to our work. So I think we might leave it there. Just one second. Let's have a look. So yeah, okay. So today we're inviting you and ourselves collectively to explore the role of artistic and creative work in lifelong and life-wide learning. And we're particularly asking, how do different forms of the arts, music, film, video making, photography, literary and poetic expression, that includes including storytelling, dance, drama, painted sculpture, including their expression in the digital world, how do they enrich the possibilities of lifelong and life-wide learning? What are the spaces and places, actual and desired, for these different forms of practice? And we do see this as very much a space where we consider some of the tensions that we're all facing. We're not trying to kind of in any way shy away from them. If anything, we're trying to look at how we shape these spaces for collaboration and reimagining. And we also consider this as something of a wild space, a space where ideas can blossom and grow. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Brilliant, Sharon. Is it just worth saying to people to reinforce welcome to those new people who've joined us today, and just to also say the way that we're going to organise things is that we're now going to have two blocks of half an hour each, where CILLA and Nick are both going to be presenting for approximately 20 minutes and or in conversation, in dialogue. We'll then take a break at 11:15 for approximately 10 minutes. And after that break, we'll go into the third element of today, where we're going to be joined by Jeremy CLANCY to be presenting and talking about his film. So I don't think we need to say any more, really, than apart from that very warm welcome. At the end of the presentations, I think the final thing to emphasize is that we want to open up, as we always do, space and time for discussion and questions amongst ourselves and to the presenters. And we also want to emphasize what next, because as we were saying, as everybody came in, the link back to the presentation that Lyndon led in May about Stoke-on-Trent, and we'll say more about that in the discussion about this idea of the third event. Sharon, I think it's only right. Do you want to introduce CILLA? Because we're only 1 minute over the time, so we've done well to keep to our slot. Do you want to introduce CILLA, and then we've got 20 minutes with CILLA and the first presentation?
Yes, I'm delighted to invite my friend and colleague, CILLA Ross, who's been an enormous inspiration to me, may I say, in terms of her work around cooperative education, but also her broader work on work and emancipatory understandings of work. And I just want to say that I'm particularly looking forward to Scylla's presentation about her time at Coleg Harlech. Thank you, Scylla.
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. You've never said that before. and likewise, of course. There's lots of people on this call who absolutely inspired me in so many different ways. I'm going to go straight to a slide deck, forgive me, but there's only 10 slides. I've timed it. I'm sort of just on the right side of 20 minutes. I'm really looking forward to what's coming next. And I've enjoyed all the presentations I've already experienced as I've joined the research circles. But let me get straight in to my presentation, and I just want to check that people can see it. Can people see that okay? I hope so. Okay, so on that note, what I'd like to do is just begin by saying hello, I'm CILLA Ross. It's great to be here. I'm really happy to contribute to the research.
Scylla, it's not showing yet, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Just to let you know.
Let me try again. It should be. That's weird. Let
me just see if I need to unshare something. I don't think so. No, I'm all right.
No, it's weird because I'm actually losing. Okay, so I think I might need to.
Sharon, would it work if you know, like we've done before with Lyndon, where you shared the slides? Would that work?
It would, but I haven't got them.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Okay.
If
right.
Scylla could send them to me, I can do it straight away. No problem.
I will do. And I'm sorry, apologies everyone, because we just practiced it and
it was fine.
It worked. So I don't know what's happened here. Okay. Sorry about this.
Send them over to me, sir, and I'll stick it in. I can share it, no problem.
Yeah.
Not arrived yet.
No, it hasn't. It's coming. Okay, I've sent that over. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
But I'll make a start if I may, because that's always sensible. So yeah, as I said, I'm CILLA Ross. I'm delighted to be joining you today. And what I wanted to do is begin by sort of, saying how important it is for me to do this work on Wales. I've only got a little bit of Welsh heritage in me, but as a Scouser, most of my holidays were spent in caravans over the border. But much more importantly for me, I was a Coleg Harlech student a long time ago now, between 1978 and 1980. So deciding what lens to use for this short presentation was a real challenge. I mean, I could have just discussed the wider adult education residential movement in the UK, to celebrate it and to mourn its apparent loss. I could equally have focused on the culture with reference to the title of this research circle and how it's never ever, as Raymond Williams knew so well, ordinary. Or I could have used the time to deliver a sort of call to action for adult education, for critical and radical pedagogy, and for the sort of transformation that radical education, using a whole range of pedagogies, is essential for the time we're in. However, I concluded that what I do, I'd be able to do all of these things, in fact, by simply telling the story of a young woman, a 23-year-old, one of the youngest at Harlech at the time, who had her world opened, shaped, completely disrupted and turned upside down by the experience of being a student at that college. And what came out of that, what the learning was was for me to take an intersectional approach to political adult education, to lifelong learning. And it was through the Harlech experience and the thinking I did there that began all that. By the way, just before we move on, I don't know if Sharon's received the slides. Sharon, have you?
Slides are just downloading, Cilla.
Okay,
Got
I'll
them.
keep
Thank
going
you.
then.
Yeah.
So that's the story. And by the way, don't normally reflect on me. Normally I crack on, and the last thing I do is reflect on myself. But this is the story. Well, the part one, if you like, of my own education, which fostered my politics, which fostered my practice. And although, you know, I left the college with a University of Wales diploma in history and politics, I wanted to ask, what did I really get from Harlech in addition to the beginning of the narrative arc of my working and my political life? So begin by imagining me, a school leaver at 15, 7 years of work and politics under my belt, a pretty good shop steward. I had a T&G scholarship to get me to Harlech. I'd been working as a production line operative. And now this massive change, surrounded by castles, hills, sea, a T&G Union scholarship, terrified but resolute. So that is the person who you're going to be introduced to you to if we actually get the slides going. How's it going, Sharon? Any look? If not, I'll keep going. We can look at some pictures in a minute. Before I went to Harlech, it's important to say there was already a lot of politics in my life. There'd already been a tension of kinds between what I was understood to be the materialist conception of history, what Marx and others called the structural, and what we would call the arts, the culture, the everything else as the superstructural. Thanks. You can just move on to the next slide, but that one, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Sharon. It's fantastic. And what you can see on this slide are some of those influences that I already took with me. But it is important to stress that although the people, my grandparents there in that picture massively helped to shape my politics, you know, that politics was one that was evident to me, that knowledge about them was evident to me. But of course, Jonathan Rose reminds us that everybody has an extraordinary intellectual life. It's just that I managed to get hold of the diaries, letters, and knew those two grandparents, and they could share that politics with me. So my own cultural context here is sort of laid out on this slide. It was one rooted in the Independent Labour Party and municipal socialism. My grandparents, one was an urban cowman in Liverpool, the other was a serving maid, had both left school at 12, but at some stage, and I don't know when and where, they'd come across politics and they developed this notion of the common good. They believed in socialism. They believed that socialism would achieve this. But the only way we get socialism, said Nana and Grandad, was independent working class education. It all hinged on that. They were autodidacts. They were in awe of education. They were deferential to it. They were self-taught in Esperanto. They were immensely class conscious. They were voracious readers, but not of theory, which was the big gap I perceived. But it was William Morris, it was Dickens, it was Shelley, and it was Whitman that they drew on. They believed in the power of art and literature and music to change the world. So they were great supporters of liberal adult education, but they also believed in remaking capitalism. And that picture of Shelley's book there is one I currently hold in my hand. I have a number of books that massively influenced my grandmother as a young socialist, and she passed them on to me, of course, when she died. And at the bottom of that slide, and I'm not going to read it, you can see it, was my father writing home to his parents. He was also a socialist. He was writing from Germany. He'd experienced army education. He wanted to change the world. And of course, at the end of there is a reminder of when I went to Harlech, it was just about to unfold as that winter of discontent. So you know, the stuff I'd learned from my grandparents I took with me, but I'd started as a shop steward to think about militancy, to learn about Marx, to talk about economics, and I was caught up in what we can deem a materialist, struggle for progress. So I needed something else. I felt this, the truth and knowledge I'd got from other places wasn't enough. So I went to Harlech. And if we could just go to the next slide, please, Sharon. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I will make the slides available. You're very welcome to them if they're of any interest. Just to say that, Harlech was born from an extraordinary number of circumstances amongst extraordinary people. It was developed as a residential education facility. There'd already been lots of summer school traditions in the area. And of course, there had been in the South Wales coalfields. 27 was a time when there were all sorts of incredible tensions, as many of you will know, between Ruskin and the Plebs League, the ILP, and the early WEA. So there was all that going on. There was also, of course, a mining community who were largely aligned to the Liberal Party. They weren't Labourites, but those that were Labourites tended to be pretty hardline Marxists. So all that stuff was going on. And some amazing people first went to Harlech. This is a link to the first 6. This little table shows the first 6 students who went to Coleg Harlech. So it opened with 6. Shop assistant, miner, steelworker, quarryman, miner, steelworker, miner, quarryman, miner. More than 6 there. But they were the very first ones. They were able to go for free purely through philanthropy. There was no system, of course, of grants of any kind then. And because there was some slight suspicion over Coleg Harlech, which you can read more about from the references I give at the end, that meant that the early trade unions weren't giving out scholarships, indeed didn't do until the NUM didn't give out scholarships to Harlech until 1949. Local authorities, corporations did start to give some money to people who attended the college, but it largely came from philanthropy, from the very wealthy. Even then, there was this enormous question was this learning adult education or was it propaganda? People will be very familiar with that tension, and it was certainly very similar in the co-op movement. And of course, the cooperators were unashamedly supportive of propaganda because they wanted to change the world, so they didn't have a problem with it. But of course, polite society did, and certainly those philanthropists who gave the money for Coleg Harlech were very concerned about Harlech being a hotbed of socialism. So what we can see there is also the curriculum was arts, humanities, social sciences, Welsh, of course, Welsh language and literature, and that. So it had quite a balanced curriculum, and indeed, carried on then until the period I went there, until a series of mergers, and then sadly a closure in 2019. The last bursar at Harlech was managed to save some of the archive, unlike in some of the flaming adult residential colleges I've been associated with, and it now sits up in what is now the Harlech Library and Institute in the town. So you can actually get to see some of the incredible resources. Others are held in the university, in the Library of Wales, and which the WA have helped to enable. But Harlech, just to conclude on that, you can see a picture, beautiful, rather romantic picture of what the estate, when it belonged to a Kropotkin multi-millionaire, before he sold it at a cheap price to Tom Jones, who started the whole thing. That's what it looked like. But of course, sadly, it has been a massive victim of the whole neoliberalism of adult education and new public management and so on. So sadly, that closure's happened. But when I went there, it was alive and it was kicking. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to reflect on what I wanted. I said something. What I really wanted was theory, theory, theory. I thought that this arts and this culture and this literature, it was all right. It was good. I'd read Zola, I'd done all that stuff, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I needed to have that sort of concrete material understanding. of the world. So before I went to Harlech, I spent the summer, once I knew I'd got in, reading Capital volumes 1, 2, and 3, and I defy anyone on this call to have admitted that they've actually read volume 3. I think I'm the only person who hasn't. Put your hand up if you if you know different. But also, you know, I was sort of, you know, shaped by this notion and this tension which has carried on through my life, if I'm honest. And that's a perfect little quote from Noah Ablett. Education, particularly the kind needed by workers, is not that impartial thing so much gushed about by education. It's a very harsh thing to say, but there is that tension. It's always been there for me. Liberal adult education versus worker education, and what is what, and what do we mean by what's needed by workers? And these will be concepts and arguments and reflections that you will have all had. Sorry, just to go back, please, Sharon, just to finish on that one. So I wanted a template for action. I believe that knowledge was something I would get, that I would be given by attending formal education. So pedagogically, I was waiting for that great big load of learning to come to me so I would understand the world, so I'd get a context and an explanation. And just finally on that, what started to infect and shape me was starting to read some of the anarchist writers as well. But what they equally did, of course, was to remind me that it was education that would hold the new society together. So just finally on this slide, it wasn't just about me, CILLA Ross, going there as a student, trying to make sense of everything, but I started to think about education for social movements. And that came out very, very strongly from some of the anarchist literature that I was exposed to. Thanks very much, Sharon. On to the next slide. Okay. Wasn't very long, really, before Harlech started to work its magic. And I am a romantic. I'm a hopeless romantic. So why do I even have this tension between the arts, humanities, and the social sciences? I don't know. And I've just got 3 pictures there and a little quote from someone I know will be known to many people on this call. It began to work its magic because the pedagogy of the place was powerful. The pedagogy, which I have learnt about and I've taken with me forever, was actually one of encouragement. It was about encouraging me as someone who had left school at 15, who was struggling really with understanding the world. But it was a place where I could do my learning alongside others who were largely class conscious. I mean, some people more political than others. Some people were at the college just because they wanted to get away from their situation. But there was also a lot of class consciousness. A sense of place grew very quickly. It was a place of great beauty. And that is shown, I think, very strongly from that quote from Derek Tatton. Whilst getting into King Lear in a big way, led by a tutor who had a fine adult education track record, we could gaze at the murals around the room and through the large windows across the dunes to the expanse of the sea. Those murals, which were painted by students during the Depression, linked the college really strongly with South Wales. But also Derek experienced in the 1960s, as I did, a staff team that was not only had incredible lived experience as students of adult education, have been shaped by adult education, but they really stress their own roots in their teaching, learning, their pedagogy, and their research. So just one example is the incredible Lewis Lloyd there. And it says so much about interdisciplinarity that if you read about Lewis, who's dead now, but it said his interests, his areas of activity were politics, history and culture, literature, and writing. He did the lot. He was an extraordinary character. He was a philosophical anarchist. He said, CILLA, I think you need to read beyond Marx. You need to think about the type of education we need for a better world. So there was that sort of stuff going on. I can go on to the next slide, please, Sharon. And, you know, that Derek talked about art everywhere. These are just 3 of the, I think, exquisite murals that sat in one of the public spaces in Coleg Harlech. Baker was a painter, a ceramicist, a sculptor. He studied at the Royal College under William Rothenstein. He came to Harlech to execute these murals, painting the lived experience of students as they were studying there. Interestingly, for some people on this call, he went on to become the director of Stoke-on-Trent Art College, just by way of interest. And then he became a chief designer at the Royal Worcester Porcelain Company. I'm not saying he was the best artist in the world. It didn't matter. What this person was painting was either in getting ready for the theatre in the first image, sitting in the library or the staff room. What this person was painting was the people in the place. There was art everywhere, and we were very much exposed to that at Harlech. Next slide, please, Sharon. Next door to the college, I don't know if any of you have been to the site, the Great Hall was burnt down in '68. By the time I got there, this magnificent brutalist building designed by Gerald Latter was in place. It had opened, which is now considered by the 20th Century Society to be a building at risk because of the closure of the college. It sits right next to it. And alongside with the college's tower. But the wonderful thing, as a young woman who'd not really been exposed to much theatre, my grandparents had talked about the Unity Theatre, which of course was a communist theatre in Liverpool. But I suddenly started to read Shakespeare. I'd never read Shakespeare. People like me didn't read Shakespeare, but I read the Arden Shakespeare. And those of you who've looked at those wonderful Arden things, you've got Shakespeare on one side and plain English on the other. So it sort of starts to make sense. I saw Bertolt Brecht plays at Theatre Ardudwy. I worked there to make a bit of extra money. What learning literature, reading, drama of this kind did for me was suddenly I was looking at power in different ways. I was looking at relations between people. I was looking at politics. I started to understand how important literature was to learning about things. So that theatre next door, which is extraordinary, is still there. It's just received an £8,000 grant to see what can be done about it. So on to the next slide, please, Sharon. And of course, above all, there was the poetry, the politics, the poetry of context. And I just want to say a little bit about this. You know, there's obviously the famous ones like Dylan Thomas, which I read. I studied Welsh literature alongside of politics. There's so much of that. I don't want to be stereotypical, but everybody on this call knows it's such a lyrical place. Wales, it's full of poetry, and Harlech was full of poetry. And one person who tried to capture this at the time, particularly the suffering that took place in the valleys, was during 1926. His great work is on the general strike. Was Idris Davis. He was a son of a Welsh-speaking colliery worker. He himself left school at 14 and spent 7 years underground. He was very much involved in the general strike, followed by many years of unemployment. And it was all that really, plus his own background, that confirmed him as a socialist. He wrote beautiful poetry. He found beautiful things in the hillsides, in the lights, in the valley. He wrote about love and comradeship and all the romantic things that I sort of care about as well. But he also wrote about suffering. He wrote about inequality. And it sounds crass to say, but he brought that to life in a way I had never really thought about in poetry. Okay, my grandparents had seen that through Shelley, and I began to value poetry through reading Idris Davis as a tool for radical lifelong learning. T.S. Eliot, who worked for Faber at the time, of course, and helped to choose Idris's poems for the second book, actually considered it was one of the finest poetical documents made about reading. There's about specific time and place, about people who felt abandoned and isolated. His interest, though, was in people's feelings and their sufferings. And I've just put that quote there because, again, this is this tension for me. This is from his unpublished diary held in the National Library in Aberystwyth now. And as you can see there, he writes about beauty, but he also writes about human need, the meanest tramp on the road being the focus of his thinking. And that conflict and tension has continued for me. And I can live with that now. But what I know is the beauty that comes out in poetry, writing, art, literature is something I have to have in my life as an adult educator. On to the next one, please, Sharon. Okay, we're getting to the almost penultimate slide. I've started the research. I'm not one of these people who looks backward. I didn't think, although I sort of value nostalgia. We'll talk about that perhaps later. But all of those people that surrounded me, what did they become? You know, I've never even bothered, not because I didn't care about them, but life moves on, you know, you just move on, don't you? But I've started to get correspondence with them. I've started to interview them. I've started to talk with them. And they became mainly people working for others, supporting others, enabling others, poets, artists, policymakers, social workers, MPs. One became the mayor of Blackpool. The other became deputy editor of Poetry Wales. So they all were extraordinary people, and we all got different experiences out of being at Harlech. Right from the top, someone who spent their life working in adult education, someone who reflected on the fact that they were no longer had to be in a sausage machine, but there was proper education, and that things had changed, right through to someone who remembered me as wanting to write to Margaret Thatcher to complain about something, but said, I have moved to the right of British politics since my time there. But even they went back a few years ago. There was nobody in the library, and I stole a book that was on my course. I had to have it. And obviously I've included that quote because it just, when you unpick it, it says so much. Their politics are different now. They're certainly different to mine. But the value of their experience at Harlech, the education they got was so important. The learning they got, the way they valued that book. Next poem, next poem, thank you. Just very briefly, what did I learn? What have I taken with me through a long life? Of course, as I'm reiterating, the role of the arts and radical learning is of equal value to anything else. I sort of knew it, but I really needed to learn it, and I've learned it. I've learned that encouragement is a fundamental teaching method, pedagogical approach. Encouragement, that's what it's all about. Everybody has the capacity within them. And, you know, when you work with adults, you know that. And encouraging means that you get the bravery and the confidence to be the person that you can be. I believe that all knowledge is equal. No discussion. I believe that human agency makes all things possible as well as all things terrible, as indeed we're experiencing now, I would say. I believe that critical reflection and reasoning collectively make learning, knowledge and activism happen. Everyone on this call will probably agree, but that's the learning I did then as a young woman, and also that adult education is from cradle to grave. And then finally, Sharon, my final slide, really, you know, what about me? I've got this looks a bit pretentious in a way, but that little picture at the top, bed hair, as they call it in the magazines, is me with my PhD, where I went back to interview where my grandmother had been a weaver in Nelson, writing about the rise of the ILP and so on. And then some of those pictures are just a mishmash of work I've done, how I've done it, who with, in various contexts. Funnily enough, that picture in the middle, Sharon, is I took a group of students and co-workers from the Cooperative College to Cwmni. So that's them there. But of course, what I've also taken from me is a sort of the continuing ongoing tension. And I've just put the quote in there from Gramsci. You know, on the one hand, Gramsci talks about the organic intellectual, and you will all be familiar with this, most of you, the idea that, you know, it's in us, that we are planted in the world, and that we, you know, we emerge working to build consciousness and to develop, establish power, and we do that through adult education. Gramsci, also writing in the 30s, was able to say the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. That's been the motto I've taken through my life. I love the fact, and my partner and I were talking about this last night, so I just found this quote. It might not be appropriate, but now is the time of monsters. Just resounded so strongly and powerfully. And all I know, and I guess everyone on this call will know too, that one of the ways we can fight those monsters and go for that new emerging world is to continue the practice of radical adult education, and that to do that we need the tools of understanding, which include all of the wonderful things that help shape our culture and our thinking, whether that be understanding about surplus value or working alongside and with film, literature, poetry, art, and it all has to come together in that mix. So thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Scilla. I knew some of what you were going to say in kind of outline, but not the depth and the texture and the examples. And it was wonderful to hear at each stage. And I think that final quote that you've posed for us not only relates to the particular and your own experiences, it certainly links to, I think, what Nick is going to highlight, and in turn, some of the other work that's been shared before today. And I think that we've tried a slightly different approach this time, which I think hopefully people have found really helpful, where Nick kind of prompted us to have a look at the some films, and I'm delighted that we're joined today by Colin Thomas, and I think we'll be able to invite Colin to comment about some of the particular examples of his work with Nick and with others. I wonder whether at this stage, Scilla, you wanted to take questions, or should we hear from Nick and then perhaps have a sort of a 10-15-minute discussion? Because I think the two presentations link. Would you be all right with that? Does that, I don't know what you feel about that.
I'm very happy with that. I'm really looking forward to hearing Nick, because I know Nick and Nick's brilliant work. But also, I did go over slightly over time, and I do send my apologies. And thank you, Sharon, for saving the day with the slide. I don't know what happened there, but so because of that, it was a bit mismatched. But that sounds great, Ian. Let's do that.
Yeah, and I think the comments in the thread in the chat there, Scilla, say, you know, so strikingly the affective response and the connections with what you spoke about, which was wonderful. Nick, I wonder whether we could kind of move, and looking at the time, that we'll now take about half an hour and then we'll take a 10-minute break. Because Nick, if at first, in terms of context, if I could invite you to talk a little bit about your work and your work with the Raymond Williams Foundation and your work in Wales, and then we can perhaps pick up on some of the particulars that were in the films that were sent out. Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that sounds good.
Welcome.
Thank you for the invite. It's really lovely to be here. Hi everybody. I thought what I would do, I'll say a little bit about Raymond Williams Foundation, then I thought I'd try and frame what I'm going to talk about briefly in relation to the work with Cwmni Bro. I thought I'd try and put it in the context of of Raymond Williams's ideas around culture, because I think I'm at least convinced they're really helpful. It's a really helpful way of framing it, and we can discuss whether you agree or not afterwards. So yeah, my name's Nick. I'm here in my capacity as the development coordinator for a small charity called the Raymond Williams Foundation. And Raymond Williams Foundation was founded when Raymond Williams passed away at the end in 1989. Excuse me. It was founded to continue. It's founded by Derek Tatton, who was mentioned in Scilla's presentation, who was an adult educator all his life, and he wanted to continue the legacy of Raymond Williams, particularly in the area of adult education. Of course, Raymond Williams was involved as a WEA tutor for many years, and a lot of his writing around adult education and other things, particularly the most famous book Keywords, came out of his experience as an adult educator. So I've been involved with the Raymond Williams Foundation for over a decade, and the role of development coordinator, I suppose, is has always been about thinking about how we can continue that legacy, build on that legacy of thinking about adult education. And Raymond Williams' whole body of work and his enormous range of ideas and his philosophy and his politics, how we can build on that legacy um, through the medium of a small charity. And my role, I guess, has been to, with Sharon and others, think about that constantly, how we could do that with this small charity. And I've been going out for the last few years, trying to find partners and organizations, grassroots groups, other people who want to continue with that work. And Raymond Williams Foundation offers small grants to adult learning projects on the ground. Usually small grants of no more than about £1,500 to seed these projects and to try and allow them to happen in some way. And then they can continue on from there, hopefully, if they work out. So that's the brief context of that work. So I'm going to talk a bit about culture for just a few minutes through the Raymond Williams lens. And I think it gives a sense of much needed, well, probably not much needed, but it gives a sense of drama to the challenge we face if we talk about culture through a Raymond Williams lens. And then I'll talk about some of the adult learning work that is very much part of what Cwmni Bro do in Wales. In a sense, as what I think is a really interesting emerging line of work around adult learning. And it does chime with other grassroots groups are doing around Britain, but also it's a more sustained and long-term piece of work than I've been able to find in lots of these smaller groups. So I think it's a really interesting project, and it's also a national project in terms of a Wales-wide project. It's increasingly becoming that way. So hopefully that'll be of interest. And then we'll come back to how that kind of meets the challenge of renewing culture in this sort of Raymond Williams sense. So I'll start with culture. So culture for Raymond Williams, he said in keywords, I think, that it was one of the most complicated words in the English language. Everything's pretty complicated for Raymond Williams, so in a good way, usually, but culture even more so than other things. So I'll give you a sense of some of the ways that he would think about culture. He thought about culture. I mean, the dominant way of thinking about culture is, as in his words, arts and learning. CILLA talked about this. The kind of liberal idea of adult education is very much working on these lines. It's the canon, bodies of literature, bodies of knowledge, established knowledge, books, music, poetry, plays, the arts. And what we now know, I suppose, is the culture industries or the culture sector is part of that, very much part of that dominant understanding. So we know what that is, I think, and yeah, we can obviously try and fight to sustain adult education that provides that access to those to spaces to learn about those forms of culture, and that's obviously important. But Raymond Williams is probably more famous for thinking about culture as a whole way of life, what he called a whole way of life. In a sense, that's a kind of what may now be an old-fashioned anthropological sense of culture, thinking about culture as a whole way of life. So, yeah, I think you understand what that means. Everything we think and do as individuals and in communities. But there's a third and a fourth meaning, which I think are just as important as these first two. The third one is culture as a practice of individual, creative, collective meaning making in everyday life. So it's linked to the anthropological sense of culture as a whole way of life. But this is a more dynamic idea of culture, which is that meaning is made constantly through conversation and through doing things. Meaning is constantly contested and remade through living. in ways, this is absolutely fundamental, I always think, to Raymond Williams, in ways that we cannot know in advance. So it's a dynamic process of like call and response, you might think of it. And we cannot know that what's going to come out of that in advance and out of those cultural meaning making kind of practices. And in a sense, also, this is the key to understanding Williams' idea of sort of democracy and community. It's something that we can't know in advance. It's something that we can all have a role in building, and we all should have a role in building. And this is also key or absolutely essential to understanding what the fourth meaning, which I'll mention here, of culture, which is Raymond Williams' idea of common culture. Now, this is a really complicated and interesting idea, common culture, and I haven't got time to go into it in much depth at all here, but I think it's really worth mentioning. Common culture is Raymond Williams, in a sense, political endpoint, if you like, is where he wants us to get to. Common culture means, for Raymond Williams, a non-elitist society, a non-hierarchical society, a non-hierarchical form of culture. It's based on an equitable division of distribution of resources. It's based on being able to resource spaces that allow people collectively to reimagine their world, to enact decision making in grassroots or in community level and in societal level in a democratic way, and to collectively develop a new society that's fair, equitable, and affirms people's right to a culture that kind of in his words fosters natural growth. That's what the term he uses. So that's his idea of common culture. Where are we in relation to that vision? Well, we're still very far away, and it's receding into the horizon at the moment, it seems. But I think that it's worth reflecting on that term still and that ideal, because we still hear a lot in our politics about common culture, but not in a good way, obviously. We hear it about our common cultures being eroded now increasingly, and this is the rise of the far right. The far right, in fact, has now increasingly clear critique of society and the need to get back to a common culture. And it's a cultural critique as much as anything else. And it's a cultural critique of the status quo based on the idea that others are taking resources from us, whoever we are, we know who we are in the right conception, and it's a culture of blaming others for existing inequities of property, inequities of remuneration, inequities in our resources, inequities of respect. If we can, it's a culture of blaming others who are in this right-wing ideologies idea are different. And it's also a culture, interestingly, that says that the liberal left and the status quo are somehow blocking a kind of libertarian, freewheeling, democratic, shared idea of who we are. So it's very, in a sense, it's very sophisticated in that it does take a lot of the tropes of the left, libertarianism and democracy, and this idea of kind of freewheeling culture, and then deploys them to criticize the status quo and say that there is and say that if we can block these others and these liberals, we can return to a more harmonious common culture. So I wanted to mention all of this because I think that the right has increasingly worryingly got a very strong idea of a common culture, and the left hasn't, or at least hasn't got this strong cultural idea, and it's not being propagated through collective organizing or collective bodies or collective institutions anymore, at all at the moment. well, very, very small. The good news, I'm sure you'll need some by now, is that these adult learning spaces that Cwmni Bro and others are been cultivating, I do think there's something there that can be, that needs to be put into this context. The adult learning spaces, which I do think there is emerging from these adult learning spaces in microcosm and through their connections and through their development more expansively, there is this sense of a common culture that's being cultivated in these spaces. So I want to affirm, if you like, from this Raymond Williams perspective and from my own perspective, really, and from other and hopefully others, and certainly those involved in Cwmni Bro, that these sorts of spaces of adult learning are important in their own right, but also important in terms of the kind of conjuncture we're in at the moment and the absolutely, obvious need for antidote and alternatives to the what's becoming more and more dominant. So let's have a look. I sent you those links to the film and about Cwmni Bro, and the links to the film about culture is ordinary. I'll give you a quick march through the history of how Raymond Williams Foundation and kind of met Cwmni Bro and how we've kind of developed a bit of a relationship over the last few years. It came about 2019, 2020. Sharon and I and others were working on ideas for the Raymond Williams centenary, which was in so Raymond Williams the centenary of Raymond Williams' birth was in 2021. So we wanted to do some events and some activities around that. We organised some meetings in Wales, and we said we put an open call out through any networks that we had around who wants to meet up in Cardiff and talk about what we could do for the Raymond Williams centenary. And quite a lot of organisations in Wales answered that call, more than they did in England, unsurprisingly perhaps. And one of the organisations that turned up drove 4 hours from North Wales to Cardiff were a group of people from Cwmni Bro who I hadn't met and I didn't know anything about, but they immediately found them, super easy to talk to and fascinating and interesting and fun to be with. Out of that work grew a desire to sort of do something together. We applied for some Arts Council Wales funding, and the Culture is Ordinary film was born out of that. So one of the ideas of Raymond Williams we thought it would be worth celebrating during the centenary. Everyone agreed that would be worth doing more about was the idea of Culture is Ordinary. And this film the idea of the film was to kind of try and explain that idea, if you like, through focusing on a set of groups that embodied that idea in the contemporary moment, and specifically worked with youth as well. So it offered some kind of hope about how that work was kind of continuing and being built on and developed. Hopefully some of you have managed to see that film. If you haven't, I provided a link to it, and you may want to have a look because it's quite a nice film to watch. It's got these nice youth groups doing good and interesting work. And interestingly, they use lots of different mediums, whether it's dance or drama or radio or video or all sorts of different media to do their work. And one of the things you'll see if you look at the film is that it definitely embodies learning, and it's very much also a holistic approach to learning. So it's learning by doing, learning by talking, learning from it cross generations, and that's something that's a strand that runs through all of this work. Has a very holistic approach. It's not very located or firmly located in disciplines or expertise of one kind or another. It's very collaborative and very contextual, and they use this word holistic, and I'm using it now too. But I'll come back to that. So that's the film. I'm not going to dwell too long on that because I need to get through some other bits and pieces here. Cwmni Bro, more generally, is a platform or a network. They call themselves of that brings together independent co-ops and enterprises in blind. First and foremost, it came out of the town of Blaenau Ffestiniog in North Wales, the ex-slate mining town, one of the poorest places socially, not socially, but economically in Wales. And because of that level of poverty, a lot of social enterprises and co-ops sprung up there over the years in a response to try and respond to the situation there. And a man called Cell Williams had the thought of why don't we try and bring some of this work together in a network so that we can identify common ways of thinking, common challenges that are common to do this sort of work, different possibilities that we could do, even cooperate on funding bids and practical things like that, and building and sharing trust with one another, and also help so we can engage and work with more people in the community there. And also so that we can together work and learn from the shared history in that part of the world. And that is a shared history that CEL very much emphasizes as one of exploitation, but also community building and mutual aid and support. So they've developed this platform called Cwmni Bro over the last 8-10 years or so. And it's also to help very much to help the community, or to work with the community to change the narrative of what Blaenau Ffestiniog is all about. It's not just a place to be born into and leave because there's no work there. It's a place to stay and try and develop. So it's a community development project. The social enterprises I should mention, some of them, they're very wide ranging, from a cinema to a pub and a hotel, community-owned pub and hotel, to an opera company, environmental programs, shops, hardware stores. There's even they're buying property to turn into emergency accommodation for young people, unemployment advice centre. It's all kinds of mountain biking business to provide revenue for the whole thing. So there's a wide range of enterprises and co-ops. It's seen very much as, so it's an enterprise. It's about making money. But it's very much about taking assets back into community hands, and the income generated through these assets. What the project has shown, a much higher proportion of it is invested back into the community than it would be if there were commercial businesses, which are usually often owned by people outside the community, and so the money would flow back out of the community rather than be reinvested into it. You can read more about Cwmni Bro on their website. They've also got a YouTube channel with lots of films about it. One of the ideas that CEL worked on in the last few years, before he sadly passed away earlier this year, and quite suddenly passed away, which is incredibly sad. But one of the ideas that he worked on was the idea of communitization. Communitization is an idea, basically, his version of socialism, in a sense, is about community ownership and control. He wouldn't want to use the word socialism because he needed to get funding bids and he needed to work with the system. But it's very much about working with the system because he needed to work with the system, the local authority, Welsh government, all sorts of groups, to try and change it. He wanted to work with the system, but try and change it. He wanted to create a community development project that would allow resources and capital to stay under as much local control as possible. And yeah, Cwmni Bro, as I said, is taking control of many local assets, and as it gets control of more assets, it's able to kind of leverage those assets to buy more assets, and so that's what it's done. And then it's linked over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's also linked up with other areas in North Wales and broadened this network. So there's a new network there that's, well, not new, a few years old now, called Cwmni, and that's basically the Cwmni Bro platform, but spreading through North Wales and becoming a network of networks of these social enterprises and these spaces where people cooperate and where the community gets involved in these spaces to set the priorities and guide the whole process. In 2022-23, CEL and myself and others started to talk more with adult education, Adult Learning Wales, sorry. Adult Learning Wales is like the WEA in Wales. And we started talking to them about what the role of adult learning is in Cwmni Bro and Cwmni, and trying to think about the question of how could an institution like Adult Learning Wales support the development of these community development projects. To our surprise, somewhat in some ways, Adult Learning Wales told us very categorically that they saw themselves as a community development organisation, and that they wanted to cooperate, and they, or they wanted to discuss this and really wanted to be involved. We applied for a grant from them in 23 to do some work with them on this and how that could how the community development side of Adult Learning Wales could develop, and how Adult Learning Wales might be able to provide curriculum and support to community development in Wales of the kind that I mentioned in relation to Cwmni Bro. In 2024, CEL and I and others ran a training day for Adult Learning Wales to talk about all of this with their tutors, and it was a really good day. So this link between formal adult education, informal adult education, community development is started to be established more formally, if you like. So the question now, I guess, the question in the last year or so is how does that link develop from here on? How do those connections develop between formal, informal adult learning and community development, and this project of getting more and more people in Wales and hopefully elsewhere involved in this kind of alternative movement that's very much at the antithesis of what in a sense reform might talk about in terms of developing a common culture. It's a common culture instead of much more along the lines of that Raymond Williams talked about. And indeed, these connections aren't purely coincidence. Cwmni Bro and CEL and others up there in North Wales, very much inspired by Raymond Williams. They've read a lot of Raymond Williams, and they use Raymond Williams when they write about their work a lot. So these things are not things that the Raymond Williams Foundation has introduced to them in any sense at all. They were reading Raymond Williams long before I or any of us probably were. So in these projects, there are so many ways that people come to learn about community and culture and community development. And so the question, as I said, is how to facilitate that and support that. What resources are needed to continue that work? As CEL would always say, a huge amount of this work is about listening. And I think that's, it can sound a bit trite, learning to listen, but I think in this kind of project, about community development, it's absolutely paramount. Learning to listen and learning how to work together and learning from each other in practical, useful ways, learning how to reflect together, and understanding there are formal and informal elements to this. And if you remember from the film and from the two films, that word holistic, they very much work in different registers, in different kind of areas of the community, whether it's environment or arts or business, but all the time with this vision of community building. Sometimes it might be classroom settings, sometimes it might be informal spaces. But when I've been visited Blaenau many times now, it's just as often on the street, talking to people just that you bump into and just having building those relationships. More latterly, in the last one of the projects that have come out of Cwmni Bro is is there's a link to it in the material that we sent round. Is a new project that Raymond Williams Foundation has given a grant to and has been running in the last 6 months, Community Valleys. So is Leanne Wood, the ex-politician, and Beth Winter, who would also see herself as an ex-politician, working together to develop some of these ideas of that Cwmni Bro have been pioneering in North Wales, in the valleys in South Wales. And what they've been doing, it's slightly different approach, but they've been running a series of community assemblies. They've run 3 in the valleys, getting people together just to ask them, what's gone wrong here? What's the potential here? What have we got here? How can we work together more? And that's apparently gone really well. And so the next stage of that is to build on those meetings and to do more of that work there. One of Cell's ideas, and he borrowed this from work that's happened in Scandinavia, in Sweden, is ultimately to develop what he called a parliament of communities in Wales, which is a lovely idea. A parliament of communities. That is a collectivity of communities and community action groups and community enterprises and platforms for community work and community development that can exert pressure on the system as a whole. He understood that the system is structurally needs changing just as much as it does at community level, and he understood that you'd need a big social movement of communities to exert the pressure to change it at a structural level. So I'm going to. Raymond Williams Foundation supports lots of other grassroots projects, and I could go through a whole list of the sorts of grassroots projects all around Britain that it supports, but I can't for reasons of time. But I can talk about that another time if necessary, or tell you more about that over email. I suppose I just wanted to go back to the beginning and say, yeah, the culture element is absolutely essential here. Obviously, part of what's the success of North Wales activity has been the whole background and around the Welsh language and the whole movement around the Welsh language and the independence spirit of that, the resistance to that. Cell was very much involved in that activism around that. He had some great stories around that. But I also wanted to go back to what the right are doing around common culture. It seems incredibly powerful what's going on in terms of the right's idea of common culture at the moment. But it's spectacularly, it's spectacularly bad and spectacularly work because it's so contradictory. Because it's really a form of authoritarianism. It's nothing like what Raymond Williams was talking about in terms of culture. It makes very strong claims to be grounded in libertarianism, but it's it's espousing a vision of society that's more unequal than ever. And in fact, it's kind of psychotically kind of toxic and destructive, whether it's talking about environment, and even it's got a tendency towards genocide, as we can see. It's very, very bad. And whereas if you see what's going on in some of these adult learning spaces, you can see that adult learning as a medium of social renewal, and a medium of community building. It's much closer to that idea of common culture that Raymond Williams was so passionate about: non-elitist, non-hierarchical, fostering collective reimagining, fostering a kind of a spirit of equitable distribution of resources, and democratic and collective control and change. I'll end with a quote from Raymond Williams. Again, the central breakthrough, Williams claimed, is a move from working within existing ways we are governed to a collective to collectively asking, how do we govern ourselves? So that question of how we govern ourselves and the question of how we renew adult learning, I think that they're inextricably linked at the moment. And I think we need to hold on to that. And I think that if the left's going to exert any pressure, it needs to think about that very hard and not necessarily focus on the arts and learning as a kind of something fixed that we own as liberals, and that we need to distribute more equally. But it's actually the question of governance itself now in adult learning, and the way that everyone has to have a stake in that self-governance, and that learning is key to that, learning about our context, learning from each other, learning what the priorities on communities are. And that learning is very informal often, but also absolutely crucial if people are going to have a stake in the future of their society. So thank you.
Brilliant. I mean, I think both of the presentations and the threads in the comments reflect this. Both have not only echoed what we've spoken about before, but thanks to Nick and to CILLA, and actually bringing us, for me, there's something here about the essence around nostalgia and activism, which, you know, CILLA has touched on both today and in previous discussions. And I think Nick's examples referring to the two films that were circulated on Monday, whether we're looking at the work in Cardiff and in South Wales, as well as the work in North Wales, for me are a kind of a reminder of listening to both Nick and CILLA. There's something there about very grounded, particular, local, collaborative examples that when you look at them are away from those things about how we may actually frame adult learning and adult education. So one of the challenges that we've always reflected on and spoken about is this whole task of reimagining and re-energizing. And what I've taken from both presentations today are starting points for that. And I think that, again, having watched Colin's film about a couple of weeks ago, but also the second film that Nick's referred to about the work with Cwmni Bro, there's so much in there that I think it would be great to tease out and to discuss. And Sharon, I don't know whether I know we did say we would pause now. Do we want to give people an opportunity for an immediate response, or do we want to go to a break? Sharon, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that if everybody else is, because yeah, I think a 10-minute chat now would be really useful if people can hang on, and then we'll have a 10-minute break.
Yeah, because I think it's really important to not lose the energy. Perhaps I'm reflecting on how I feel, having listened to CILLA and to I wonder whether, you know, I've looked at the chat thread, which is very much a kind of a reflection of the richness, and I think just one final comment for me, that second film, the film about the work in Blaenau Festiniog, one thing that struck me, Nick, was this argument around profit staying locally and accumulating locally. And by profit, I wasn't just myself interpreting that in a monetary way, nor value. It's kind of the value of learning and community development. And I mean, a question back, Nick, was that one of the things that you took from that work with Seth and talking with Kerry as well and others, this whole notion about value and value being grounded in local action? Was that something that struck you yourself, Nick, in the work that you were doing?
Absolutely. Community for Cwmni Bro and for Raymond Williams is very much not a thing. It's not a pre-existing entity. It's not a static thing or a nostalgic thing we can go back to. It's something that's made and remade through interaction. Community is something that's made through making meaning together and doing things together, and building those bonds of solidarity and trust through that work. So the value is in those, well, one part of the value of that community in that sense is very much that those interpersonal exchanges and that ongoing interpersonal support and that building work. So yeah, so community in that sense is a process and a practice that's the value is made through the doing. Obviously, in another sense, once you have that kind of community and it's an active and dynamic entity, you can do lots of things that you can't do on your own. You know, private problems become public issues, and you can build things together. You can do activism. You can support one another to take risks that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So yeah, absolutely.
Can I invite other people? There's lots I would want to say about this, so that this isn't just us and Nick and I in conversation. Can I open up to whether others in 5-10 minutes want to ask either CILLA or Nick particular questions, and then we could perhaps move to a short comfort break? Does anybody want to chip in with questions or reflections? Lyndon,
Okay.
I think, and then Ian Hewitt as well. Hello, Lyndon.
No, I was actually going to shut up. I've had plenty of space, but Ian can go first if he likes. I just wanted quite specifically to ask Nick, because he used the word, and it's very provocative, listening. And part of what we're doing is to think about the history of our kind of work and some of its problems. And listening in some senses costs not less than everything. And you're talking about the role, the rise of you know, kind of new right, or whatever we call them. And I wonder about how much of that is grounded in some of the failures of the left, as it were, and the failures of the left in terms of listening to one another and creating groups that genuinely felt inclusive and educative. The other point I wanted to make to CILLA was I really enjoyed both presentations, CILLA. There was something for me about the loveliness of your individuality as well as the collective. And in a way, it's a similar point, I think, that one of the problems of our history is, and I'm going to use shorthand, is the problem of groupthink, that you have to buy into a particular view of the world when internally you may be crying and screaming about that collectivity. So it's the space for the individual, which in a sense, I think was one of the main themes of your presentation. So Nick, this problem of listening and how possibly the left hasn't been very good at it at times, and for you, CILLA, the issue of the individual in all this alongside the collective.
I think just briefly, so we can have more people as well join this. The problem of listening, not the problem, or the listening is very much linked to, for Raymond Williams, and I think in these projects as well, it's very much linked to a critique of hierarchy and a critique of power. So I think the two go together. You can't, if you're going to maintain your status quo where you have such an incredibly unequal distribution of power and resources and respect, you're not going to listen. So yeah, if you're going to work with status quo, that means also working within all the hierarchies that we have that are so entrenched at the moment. So listening becomes a radical act of not accepting the hierarchies and accepting that everyone is of equal value, and accepting that also that you might not know, you know, where this thing's going to go, where this conversation's going to go, where this movement's going to go, what's going to happen next. And that isn't very comfortable if you have a hierarchy either. So yeah, absolutely. The left hasn't been. I mean, yeah, we're cutting a lot, doing a lot of shortcutting here to just have a conversation. But the left, parts of the left, most of the left, the dominant parts of the left haven't been good at listening, haven't been good at non-hierarchical organising, haven't been good at adult learning that follows that approach, those sorts of philosophies. Yeah, I think that's all I need to say at this point.
Thanks. It's really great, Nick. I really enjoyed that as well. And I just wanted to just quickly say something about intersectional listening. Of course, what that means is you have to take everybody's, and I know this is very current, but I am actually quite convinced about it, and I'm grappling with it at the minute. The point is, with intersectional listening, so you do have to listen to people's different lived experiences, the authority they have over their own lived experiences, to be inclusive and democratic. If you don't do that, you're in trouble. And of course, it often means you hear stuff you don't want to hear, as well as stuff you might want to hear. I just made that point. And thank you, Lyndon, for your comments. I mean, all I can say about that was something about, I arrived at Harlech as an individual, thinking about what I needed and what I wanted, because we didn't call it lived experience those days, of course. But, you know, the things that I felt, my value base, what I emotionally was drawn to, and so on. And then through reading, thinking, working with others, that collective learning experience, it very quickly became something that was beyond me, that was for more than me. And it opened my eyes in a way that I've never been able to shut them since. And that's been painful at times, as I'm sure it is for many people on this call. But it's been reconciling that, really. And sort of also just briefly on nostalgia, just very quickly. You know, Sharon and I've had these conversations, and many of you will be aware of these discourses, but nostalgia can be a very progressive thing because it's a yearning for something better. It's not necessarily conservative. It's about, you know, wanting a better thing, and through that sort of collective stuff and that common culture that you talked about so well, Nick. You know, it's the thing that it's messy and mucky and slippy and slidey and problematic. But, you know, you have to think what it means to be human, and you have to work out how that works best for everyone. So it is that tension between the individual and the collective. And I thank you for that question, Lyndon. I've not answered it very well, but it is something we're all still grappling with, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Marjorie, and then perhaps Ian. Marjorie, I wonder whether you'd got your thoughts, please.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you both so much. They were such stimulating contributions, and I think particularly relevant in the circumstances that we're in. I actually wanted to ask just a very specific question to you, CILLA. Out of the very sad closure of Coleg Harlech, you said that the library and I guess the archives managed to be preserved. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about how they can be used now to contribute to adult community education and development as a sort of basis for taking some of these ideas forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your comments. Yeah, I mean, all of it, we know very sadly, and you know, Martin, actually, for example, the Ruskin archive was lost quite badly. And I have to say, I think and I'm looking at Ian Hewitt here, the Cooperative College archive, you know, library in particular, and some of the resources, student records, which told that incredible story of adult education. I'm not sure what's happened to that. It's good to know that some of the resources and archive have been kept from Coleg Harlech. Yeah. Some remains in Harlech, some is in Aberystwyth, some is in Cardiff.
Yeah.
I think what the story of Coleg Harlech, which it's a particular story. I think it's a very different one than the other adult residential.
Yeah.
And I probably don't know if I conveyed that flavour. It wasn't, for example, particularly a trade union college or a particular. It had a different history, very much more rooted in, from my limited understanding of Welsh culture, you know, and Welsh experience, and that sort of that spirit of non-conformity. So I do think it's very interesting and different, and I'd love I'd love us to do some. I'd love to do something with that archive because I think it tells us something about some of the themes that Nick's been talking about. Very strong sense of cooperation, of building something together. And it's interesting that both of our examples come out of North Wales, Nick, which you don't necessarily link to a sort of radical history. Again, that could be my ignorance. But actually there is a very strong sense of a common identity, which can, which brings with it the sort of challenges you talked about, but of course also the positive, progressive possibilities as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Actually, some of us did manage to salvage some of the Ruskin archives and take them to Bishopsgate, but an awful lot was lost as well.
Just before going to Ian, just to thank Emma, who's added in the chat there, a link to the catalogue for the Coleg Harlech archive at the National Library of Wales. What we always do is circulate the chat thread, as well as the recording after the event. So that's really helpful. Ian, and then Catherine, and perhaps then a comfort break if everybody agrees. Yeah, okay. Ian. Yep.
I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Yeah, Ian from the East Midlands, according to Hope Not Hate, the epicentre of the reform and far right surge, and you can feel it, it's palpable. Yeah. Despite that, I'm wondering, though, whether we can leapfrog the small projects and go big on adult education and renewing working class culture. It may be totally stupid, but I'm very moved by Tom Woodin's co-op pageants thing. It won't sleep, it keeps emerging. Now, I'm involved in a campaign group to try and influence the new mayoralty, and she has set up a thing called the Inclusive Growth Commission, which has challenged the normal economic model. And our campaign group, the MCA Coalition, and under my influence, I think, has said we want big time adult education renewal, and we want big time public health as a focus to have inclusive growth. So it really is a bit of a stretch. But oddly enough, at the Central Co-op AGM, I pitched this crazy idea, and a lot of the members want to get involved. They've kind of been marginalised. They want a big cultural celebration. And weirdly, at the IGC feedback session, they thought the idea of getting lots of people together to celebrate what working class culture is, and what people are actually doing rather than being told, that might be a trigger. And then weirdly again, the minister, who's since been moved on, I thought he was going to kick me out of the meeting, but he thought it was a brilliant idea. So just to remind ourselves, Tom's work, Wembley Stadium was full of cooperators celebrating working class culture at the time when the British Union and fascists were on the march. So is that completely crazy?
No, I think that example is fascinating. I'd like to know much more about that. And I think Tom's on the call, but so perhaps we could pick up on that later. I know Catherine Robson, I know you got your hand up earlier. Thanks very much, Ian, for that and that example from the East Midlands. Catherine, is there a particular questions you wanted to ask CILLA and Nick?
Ian, thanks very much. Sorry I haven't got my camera today, just working off a new phone that's not playing ball at the moment. Just to introduce myself, I know many of you in the room here today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm Catherine Robson. I'm Chief Executive at Adult Learning Wales. Delighted to be working with the National Library and with the community in Harlech concerning Coleg Harlech archive. But I just wanted to add an observation concerning some of the areas that we've explored today around inclusivity, the power of listening and individualism, listening to CILLA's story. And just to share an experience I had a couple of weeks ago when I did a learning visit in Swansea at one of our ESOL classes, that's English for Speakers of Other Languages. The class was full of energy. There were learners from every corner of the world there, and we know we are experiencing huge tensions around immigration, migration, and cultural differences. And just coming back to that individualism and that listening, that the skills of that tutor in that class, and making sure that we are still true to our values and our heritage as being, our founder organisation, the Workers' Education Association, and everything that stands for, took place in that class that day. I was so humbled by what I saw and what I experienced. They were qualified professionals with strong academic backgrounds sat in an entry-level English class with Scrabble letters, trying to understand the English language, putting together the meaning of a particular word, learning how to spell it with the use of Scrabble letters. These are pharmacists, accountants, commerce people, health professionals who are having to go right back to basics. And I said to them, how does this feel? How does this feel for you? And they said, we feel like children. We feel like children. We feel extremely vulnerable, but we feel safe. We feel stimulated, and we feel we've got a chance. And we have real optimism about what is ahead for us. One individual shared with us how his sister was shot down in front of him in Sudan, but he still has hope. And I just wanted to share that little story with you because it's happening every day, and we are still holding true to our values as an organisation to ensure that community provision is what it is, and it really is meeting the hearts of so many people, and ensuring that sort of learner need is met on an individual basis. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine.
Sharon, I wonder whether could you do a wrap up before we go to break?
Yeah, we're just gonna have if I could request, we just have a 5-minute comfort break if everybody's all right with that, and come back. I'm delighted to introduce my brother Jeremy Clancy after we've had our break, and we're going to talk about his film and the making of the film, some of the important community-based decisions that the film represents as well, which definitely connects with themes that have been raised by both Nick and by CILLA, and also in Catherine's last comments. So I'm very excited to introduce him. So could we just have a brief comfort break and come back? You don't need to turn your cameras or anything off. We'll just go off screen for 5 minutes. Is everybody all right with that? See you shortly.
Right. Thanks.
So moving on to our next section, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my brother, Jeremy Clancy, who's, I'm proud to say, he's an award-winning filmmaker now, has increased his kind of profile dramatically over the last couple of years, and has done astounding work, in my view, with a whole range of progressive organisations, including Amnesty International, the World Health Organization, the TUC, and various political bodies as well. And I'm just going to ask him if he can kick us off a little bit by telling us something about the origins and the starting point for his film, The Coal Beneath Our Feet, The Wind Above Our Heads, which is a documentary which I hope all of you will have had a chance to watch. We've sent links out to it several times over the course of the last couple of months. And I'm delighted to ask him to tell us a little bit about how it all started, Jez.
Oh yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, so I met Beth Winter. I was doing some stuff for the Socialist Campaign Group, and Beth Winter was a member, and I went down to the valleys to film Beth, to make a sort of pitch film for why she should continue as the MP. And while we were down there, we met Tyrone O'Sullivan, if anyone knows Tyrone. And he was one of the key figures in the Tower Colliery buyout in 94, 95, when the miners got the chance to buy their own pit with the redundancy money and to run it as a cooperative. And just meeting him was an amazing moment. He kind of took us to the valley where the first red flag was raised. And he explained the moment when the miners in 1830 protested against conditions in the mines, and they raised the first red flag dipped in calf's blood. And myself and Beth thought it would be a great idea to make a film about Tower Colliery, and that was the starting place for the film. And originally it was just, we raised a few thousand and we just thought we'd make a 5-6 minute film for social media about Tower Colliery. But then a whole bunch of things happened. But that's the origin, the inception of the whole thing.
Yeah. So that small moment. What I'm struck by in the film, and I know many others who've commented to me and to you directly have said, is just the sheer breadth and power of it. And what really struck me was the kind of the lens that you use, whereby the young people became really important points of contact between the community itself and perhaps some of the older members of the community with whom it didn't appear they had any kind of relationship prior to the film, which I thought was really powerful. And I know when you and I have talked, you talked about that really being a powerful kind of moment of adult learning in lots of ways, that those young people learned through listening to their elders within that community. So I wondered if you'd tell us a bit about that, Jens.
Yeah, so one of the first things we thought we would do is just, I mean, for our little 4-minute film, was just to get sort of younger generation to meet some of the pivotal figures. I mean, not necessarily all linked to Tower Colliery, but there were sort of militant miners from during the strike, and kind of we thought we'd get them together. And now Tower Colliery has become this bloody awful zip world place where sort of people slide on, zip wires. So they offered us a space, and we got a bunch of young people and miners and activists from back in the 80s, 90s together. And what struck us was that the young people knew nothing about Tower Colliery, even though it was a few miles from their house. And the two young, so we got these people together to have conversations, and we filmed it, and that was going to be the film. And then we realized the young people knew nothing about their own history. So that became something we wanted to address in the film, and we thought it would be great to pick two of the young people as representatives, kind of. And we met two. There was Arwen and Owen, two of the young people. Imaris, sorry, were kind of smart, switched on, clued up, political, and yet knew nothing about their own local political history, of the working class history, and were also very jaded and cynical at 16, and just wanted to get the hell out of the valleys, get a job, and get on with life, and there was a tension there. You could sense that they recognized that their community was something important, but it had no bearing on their lives at all, to be honest.
So all they could see, it was a place to get out of.
It was get out of the valleys, land a job somewhere in London, and just do what everybody else does. And that was the little rat run that they were on, that the school had set up, and they were just following that through.
Did you get any sense that there were any turning points in their conversations? I remember the older activist woman who'd been involved with Greenham Common, I think, from.
Oh yeah, she's
amazing. Yeah.
I mean, what in the film, during the filming of the whole thing?
Yeah.
Oh man, that was the film in a way. It was I think I made about 10 trips down to Wales for 2 days. So it's like we had 2 days worth of conversations where we these two young people, we introduced them to just loads and loads of people, and we didn't really have a sense of what we were doing apart from running out of money. But there was we just let these conversations happen, and over that time you could see one, there was a kind of disgust that the young people felt that their education hadn't tapped into their own history of the valleys. They knew nothing about, the struggles of the valleys, the people of the valleys, and there was a massive disconnect that their education had never bridged.
Did they
And
not know about the miners' strike either, Jess?
well, I mean, they do, but in a very sort of, A-level history kind of way.
Yeah,
Like
impassive.
not something that happened, that it directly impacted their parents' generation and the grandparents, So, and yeah, they were just swamped with, I guess, just academia. But anyway, we brought the people together, and gradually this what became clear was that there was a lack of any kind of political awareness, and that
Yeah.
the older people, even though they hadn't been to university, there was this incredible, not politics as in Westminster, just this politics as in, the continuous class struggle, making sure that you have safety equipment in the mines, or
Yeah, absolutely.
so all of that. And then, and also there was a sense of agency in the older people that the young people didn't have. So they were fresh and bright and optimistic at 75, and these young people were jaded as fuck, kind of.
That's
And like
fascinating.
ready to give it all up,
Yeah.
because they had no sense of any agency whatsoever about their own lives. Just follow the dominoes and get out the town, get out the city, even though it kind of meant something that they weren't quite sure what or why. And so gradually, I mean, there were some real pivotal conversations. There was a great moment where Owen was a boxer in his 70s, and there are all these little mining kind of museums everywhere that don't quite do the job. I'm sure they were set up with good intention, but they don't quite do the job. But I think what did the job was just this meeting of these two different age groups. And there was a great moment as well where one of the old miners uh, recognized the young person just by the way they looked and said, "I think I knew your granddad." And he said, "Oh yes, you're just like the I can't remember the family name, but you're just like your family, very handsome, always good with the ladies," and like just filled in all these blanks. This person knew nothing about his grandfather and the history of the mine. So it was just very interesting. And there was a real thirst from the young people and the old people to connect and to discuss.
So that's cliche, but that kind of real intergenerational learning that you actually saw taking place. And also some
yeah, you
class
could.
consciousness coming in, which I guess the young people had no sense of prior to that.
Yeah, it was just very academic and very sketchy and not very and not and it, like I say, it was almost as if it was a different species that happened to. But there was a moment there's a few moments in the film, especially with Emeris, who was 16 and kind of thought he knew everything. And he would tell he told one of the old people, he said, yes, he showed him the headstock, the old, and he said, "Oh yes, I used to play there when I was a child," and the old guy said, "Yeah, but you don't know anything about what went on there. I was 14 when I went down the mines, 2 years younger than you," and it was just this shock of. And then there was a great moment at the end, towards the end of the film, where he said, "I think because it wasn't just about the mines, it was about extraction, it was about also about greenwashing, this whole thing about the fact that there was before the mines were nationalized, it was just a few mine owners who extracted all the wealth, and then it was the British state that extracted the wealth from the Welsh valleys. But then there's this then there was a shift. One of the miners, the young people said, "Well, it was great what you did, the fact that you bought out Tower Colliery, but we can't do that. We haven't got a community and there's nothing for us to buy out." And he said, "Well, what about the wind farms? Why don't you look into that?" And again, it was met with this absolute you know, this is not possible. We have no agency. We can't do that. And then he
Yeah.
said, well, why don't you just ask? And then that's when we hunted for more funding and realized there was more of a story to tell about not just looking back into the past, but looking into the future with that same set of community-led aspiration.
And that's where the engagement with the wind farm
Yeah,
owner,
the young people
entrepreneur.
they did a bit of research themselves.
Yeah.
And so we found a couple of this Vattenfall, which is like a Swedish wind farm, which is again does this terrible greenwashing thing where they give back about 0.5% of their takings from. So they did some research into it and they were like really excited, but we had to kind of decide how to contain the film, so we didn't go down a takedown of Vattenfall and all the kind of dodgy dealings, of which there are very many. But we decided to kind of relate it back to Tower Colliery and the fact that, you know, Vattenfall are amongst some of the best in terms of giving back to community, but they only give 0.05% of their takings, and they decide what they're gonna buy. So they tend to buy these big sort of showy community centers that no one uses, you know, and there's no agency and there's no invitation to the community to decide what they want to spend the money on. But with Tower Colliery, what the amazing thing was that the mine was community run with the villagers in mind. So there was a cinema built, there was community centers, all back during Tower Colliery days, and this was massively inspirational for the young people.
Absolutely.
And then, yeah, I mean, by the end of it, you know, Emrys had this complete turnaround. I mean, he's now a big community figure, and this film is touring around. He kind of goes with every showing of the film, and he's now become this vocal sort of person who wants to stay in the valley, which is weird.
God, that's amazing. I didn't know that bit.
Yeah, both of them. I mean, she's great as well. Yeah.
So you when we talked about it, you mentioned that there was a strong arts element that you picked up, particularly the guy who runs the wind farm was kind of very empowered by the idea of using the arts at community level himself, and I wondered if you'd got any observations about that.
Yeah, so what happened is we went to Vattenfall. We were all really massively dejected because we went along wondering if it was possible that the community could rent a wind farm and run it as a community-run wind farm from Vattenfall. It was absolutely not going to happen.
Yeah.
So we did a bit more digging, and then we found that there were quite a few, and we didn't know any of this stuff, and we were making it as we went along. So we found that there were community bought wind farms, mainly in the north of Wales, weirdly, but also not far away. And so we arranged a trip. We didn't know what it was going to be like, and so in a way, it was a bit of a full circle because the film starts with the closing of a school.
Yeah.
And this guy, he calls himself a social entrepreneur, raised 8 million, bought these 2 wind farms, and then he's regenerated a school and quite a lot of the community. So it's for disabilities, it's community led, and also he employed an artist to make artworks with the community, which is an ongoing project, which decorates this place. And again, the kids were like, "Oh my God, this is just." Again, it shows that just the power of the community and the fact that this stuff is all possible. And again, it was just this sense of hope being rekindled in the young people. And how hopeless they were, like I say, more so than the people in the 70s.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
That's what really struck me about the whole film.
Yeah.
They were
what do you think?
dejected and done from the very off, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really struck by that. So what do you think empowered the older people from your observation, just from, you know, having talked to them?
I think robust battling with tangible real forces that want to fuck you, you know, like
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it just makes it all very real and not abstract and kind of not academic. It's just like they were there and they were there and there was a tussle. And I think, you just got a sense of like a very clear picture of what, and that gradually emerges, in the young guy. He says, "Oh my God, I suddenly, having meet the new form of extraction, I suddenly get my connection." He had no connection with the older people. It was like he was, David Attenborough sort of connoting these.
An
Oh, you're an
anthropologist.
older person with confused, like,
Yeah.
but by the end of it, he just saw this complete affinity and said, "Oh my God,
Mm.
that's me." And he couldn't see his class. It was hidden. But I think back in the day, it was just, yeah, you're over there, we're here, and it's kind of gloves off and it's very real and tangible, and we're going to fight you. But that was hidden from the young people's perspectives. They didn't realize they were on like a kind of a well-oiled slope, greasy kind of route out of the
Yeah.
valleys, and they
Yeah.
didn't realize that they were subject to political forces.
And that's the kind of depoliticization that we've
Well, it is, yeah. I
talked
mean,
about
I
so
had it
many
in my own
times.
life, like
Yeah, me
I
too.
didn't think I was working class, until I
No.
realized, well, perhaps not in the same way, but precariously existing,
Mm.
and all of that. So I think it's a much less clear picture. But there was a great line in it where the kid was Emerus was saying, he was talking to the old boxer who said, "I look at those wind farms and I wonder, where does that money go?" Yeah, and the
Yeah.
young guy says, "Well, I never thought about that." And then he said, "Well, how about if the money went back into the community?" And he just went, and the young guy tries to articulate the sentence and he says, "Yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say." And it was the first time he was formulating these kind of political thoughts. And I just thought that was, even though he couldn't articulate it,
That was the moment.
yeah, it was just a moment where it was like you could just see the light go on.
That is so powerful. So there's because Nick was talking earlier about community asset sharing and that whole idea of communitarianism, and community ownership. And that just seems so powerful. But it's not just about community ownership of assets or resources, like we were saying earlier. It's actually about kind of memories as well and shared histories. This is something that CILLA's talk really picked up on, I think. So yeah, I know you had to make some really tough editorial decisions as well, Jess, because it was so you must have had hours and hours of film.
Well, there was a crisis moment, like it was, can we not do this anymore? Can we just stop? Because I don't know how to turn this into a film, and we had no more money, and we hadn't had any money for like 4 months. So it was just, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. And Beth would say, "I've got another person for you to meet." And it was like, so I'd come to Wales and we'd film them. It was like, oh God, you know, and the conversation would go in another direction. And this was supposed to be a 7-minute film, and we hadn't really discussed it. We just went along on goodwill. And then we had the idea, well, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of show the rushes to the people involved in the film. And I thought we could use that as an opportunity to glue together. So we had this idea of inviting everybody who'd been in the film to watch the rushes and for people in the film to speak to that little community.
Yeah.
And that became the script, if you like,
Mm.
for the whole film, for the structure of the film. And there was a kind of clear structure once we got the idea of, comparing, looking back at Tower Colliery, everything that was done there, and then taking that into the future, and that came about sort of accidentally. That was a pretty tight structure, but it wasn't really just about that. It was about hope, and it was the emotional journey of the young people, and not just the young people. There was this real bond between Anne, who was one of the militant, the lady in the film, and the
Yeah.
young and Arwen, the harpist. There was this real connection between them. So it was mutual sort of kindling of hope in both generations. And there's a bit at the end of the film where we went to see the social entrepreneur and the young guy, Emeris, just said, because he'd been really downbeat the whole time and just this real critical bugger. and he just said, "Oh, I feel hopeful," and then everyone just went, "What?" There was this
What?
moment, and there was just these beautiful, spontaneous moments where
Yeah.
people just fly on the wall, sort of filming, and then he apologizes to the audience in the auditorium during the showing, saying, "Look, I just lived in this state of, total alienation. I just kind of existed. I was just going through the motions." He said, and suddenly I saw my community, and it was just this very powerful moment.
That's really quite beautiful, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so incredibly powerful. And I mean, there's so many things that I'd love to ask you, but I guess the sort of feeling I have from this is about kind of learning from history for the future in lots of ways, which we've been trying to do through these series of research circle events since the start. This idea of being backwards travelers, looking forwards, looking to the future. And that central role that Nick talked about in the last talk about adult education, it's absolutely central if we're serious about people learning about their own histories and the common culture.
There's a great quote that Tyrone, he said that I'm probably going to get it wrong. He said, the world is the kiln and we are the clay.
Mm,
And it was just this notion of some at one point, the you have to see the kiln and recognize that, it's all been baked in from your, so just getting them to see,
yeah,
you know, what led to, these 16-year-old people's lives.
absolutely.
And it was just they got a glimpse of their political history that had made them. And
And it,
and also a sense of why they were so alienated.
yeah, absolutely. So that labor history or that the work history is so central to that.
And yeah,
Yeah,
and I think as well, because they weren't working in the mines, and they kept saying, like, it's great that you keep going on about the mines. I'm sure it's super important to you, but we're not working in mines. We have
yeah,
but what they found was through the social entrepreneurial way, I guess, because they kept talking about the glue. They had this little board at the school that they were using and pinning on everybody they'd met, little photographs and stuff. And it was a bit like a kind of detective novel with bits of red string. And,
yeah, yeah.
they
Connections.
kept saying, what is the glue? Is it the community? Is it, was it coal? Is it wind? Could it be wind? What holds communities together?
Mm,
And I guess that was like a question that they kept coming back to, and the idea that it could be any of those things actually. It could be wind, could be coal, could be whatever. But it was this the fact that community can never be taken out of the equation. If it's just the same five shareholders owning wind who own North Sea oil, and that's what they realized. It cannot ever be like that. It has to be community has to be pivotal.
absolutely. So that whole point about it being about ownership and control, something that Nick was saying about governance, and the central role that adult education's had in enabling us to think about who governs us, how society's structured, how we're bounded and defined by it, and how we can try and locate ourselves differently collectively. I think that's powerful.
And yeah, having that sense of asking those questions, like when the young guy says, "I don't know what I'm trying to say here." It was the
Yeah,
first time I even thought these, because school doesn't
no,
facilitate that kind of thinking.
no,
The bell rings, you get up. It's that.
yeah. That critical reflection's kind of not there. And that's really what
And
I guess,
it's everything that the work, the working people, they wouldn't take a single word at face value
no,
that the manager was saying. Every
no,
single thing was scrutinized and debated. And apparently in the mine, there's a place called Red Square, like
yeah,
where the miners would meet and sort of have conversations about this sort of stuff, but and it was getting, I mean, because I mean, in the Welsh Valleys, I mean, it has to be one of the most political cauldron.
yeah. And the one thing I wanted to ask you kind of last off, Jez, before I open it up, if that's all right with you, was about, you mentioned to me that you thought about your own for the first time in many ways. This was a very personal film for you because you recognise the relationship we have with that part of Wales through my granddad and our granddad, and I wondered if you'd got any thoughts on that, just because that's important and the history we know about him and my dad, as a minor, our dad.
Well, I think the reason I was so drawn to Tyrone as well is he looked like my granddad.
Did he?
Yeah, he had sort of similar high cheekbones and the nose and everything, but also he looked like my granddad would have looked had he not had his back broken,
Yeah,
had he not been crushed.
yeah, yeah.
And he'd done very well from it all. There was this whole kind of other story that we could have dug into about the miners who bought Tower Colliery and how they'd all become quite wealthy people,
Mm, mm,
and empowered wealthy people,
mm.
who kind of moved out of the area and married younger wives. It was very weird.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
at the same time, they'd started out as kind of miners. And
yeah.
and also it's fascinating. They'd hired engineers and managers, and they'd interviewed them. It was this total role reversal. But
Fantastic.
but meeting this old guy who was just full of these ideas, same age as my granddad when he died, but he was just this huge force, and I just thought that reminded me of, seeing my granddad in his council flat, like in a bed for 5 years. But anyway, that was something
But that moment as well of those stories we used to listen to from him, and without getting too personal, but that kind of shit, that sense of history of his books and his reading and those shared moments down the mine that you described in Red Square, that's reminiscent of things he talked about and my dad talked about. So that's really powerful. So it must have felt quite personal for you in some ways.
well, yeah, and I could identify with the young people. It was exactly that,
Yeah, that feeling
hearing these
evolves over.
stories about times prior to yours that that should mean something but kind of don't,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
then gradually you realize that it's one continuum.
Yeah. And it's almost hearing people's stories that brings it alive.
Yeah, I mean, there's some amazing stories too. I mean, like hours of just oral conversations with people talking about, you know, um, even just relationships, sex, everything. It was just
Yeah.
nothing was
No
off
holds
limits.
barred.
We talked about everything. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Oh, thanks so much, Jez. That's been absolutely brilliant. If you're willing, I'd love if you wouldn't mind sticking around for a bit longer. If
Oh
anyone
yeah,
has any
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
questions for Jeremy, because I noticed lots of comments in the chat. But obviously, I can't respond to them at the minute. I'm just wondering if anyone wants to ask any questions specifically. Colin, Thomas.
I confess, about halfway through this film, I had a sort of rather sinking feeling that it was going to get bogged down in nostalgia about the coalfield communities. And increasingly, it moved into an awareness of I was afraid it was not going to acknowledge the fact that coal is disastrous for the environment. But increasingly, as the film went on, I warmed to the way in which those lads, the two central characters, became aware of an alternative possibilities. And I was very struck I was moved by it, and I was very struck by the way in which you were able to see the development of the way that the two central characters changed their perspective over a period of time. I mean, most of the films that I've been involved in, you get a block of filming in 2 or 3 weeks at most, and there's no sense of a passage of time. Whereas that, by shooting over a long period and actually seeing the change in their perception, I was very impressed by that in particular, and the way in which the music and in which that the choir was joined in by the the
Oh, the
younger
girls.
children was deeply moving. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean it could have gone that way, you know, it could have got bogged down, but it yeah, and like I say, it was 14 months of filming, so you could see all of that, you know, those and you know, he kept cutting his own hair as well, Emrys, which is
Not great for continuity.
no.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if you know, Jez, because I know you've not met Colin, but Colin's a filmmaker.
Oh, great. Oh, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, and I will share his films if you've not had a chance to see them yet.
love to see them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Scilla,
Thank you. Hello, Jez. Thank you for sharing that background to what is an absolutely fabulous, heart-stoppingly good film. Tears in my eyes, of course, at the end, or indeed all the way through. I just wanted to say, and in the light of the context of this discussion, it just reminds us that, I mean, I'm gonna use words that are a bit unfashionable, but I'll say them anyway, that class consciousness is a process. And what you picked out there, I think, what you were able to tell the story of was how people became aware not only of their position in society and what had been their class experience, but also had they had, to use a coin a quote, more in common than divided them, whether that be generational, whether that be their interests, whatever it was. And I think that was so powerfully shown in that film. And the sort of pinch point of that, of course, was the industry, the industrial base. And of course, that's always difficult, isn't it? And this is my question to you as a filmmaker. I've done a bit in the steelworks in South Yorkshire and in Camberlaird's using oral history. But when that folk memory sort of goes, that's quite a challenge, isn't it? Can you say, did that concern you when you started making the film, that there did seem to be this loss of folk memory? How did you think about that at the time?
Yeah, I think it was this notion of, I think what the big breakthrough for Emrys, seeing his connection, is after we'd been to Vattenfall, and he just said this sentence kind of unprompted, just saying that it was the lack of agency he felt of having any say at all about what happened to the, you know, the extraction of the wind energy or the coal energy, and he suddenly saw that, you know, the coal mines hadn't really, you know, it had decimated the Welsh valleys in terms of ecologically, it was destroyed, you know. But at the same time, you know, while the pits were running, they'd given a little bit of money back, but nothing much, you know. And then it was just this notion that the wind farms were doing exactly the same thing, and it was the lack of agency that is at the heart of class consciousness, you know. And that's what it was about. It was like, yeah, everything else had changed. He wasn't working in a mine, but he had no control over his own life, and his community was being pulled apart because he had no agency or no control. And I think that was what chimed for him. It was, yeah, it's the same thing, you know. Yeah, I feel like I'm free, I'm going to London, but I would prefer to stay here, but I can't.
yeah.
So it was just this notion of seeing people who being done to and being, you know, my granddad was a miner, had to leave the Welsh Valleys to come to Derbyshire. Had to, you know, and he had to leave the Welsh Valleys, this young kid, you know, has to go and live in London, you know. So it's the same itinerant worker thing. So
Yeah.
that's what, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you. So, Ian.
Yeah, just quickly, I need to watch the film, obviously. Apologies for not having done that. But I just wondered whether you'd thought about Sherwood Energy Village at Ollerton as a case study, because I was a member of that community co-op, and it was really sad to see it. It's now a granny farm industrial complex, I think. But all that idea about replacing coal with, you know, energy efficiency and new energy sources was really inspiring at the time. And secondly, your pick up on people believing the managers. I was recently at a debate with Rolls-Royce and Associates, who make nuclear reactors for submarines, and Bruce Kent, when he was alive, from CND, questioning whether nuclear submarines were a great idea. And the sad thing for me that the Rolls-Royce and Associate people were trade union representatives, and they simply quoted what the managers had told them. And they couldn't see beyond, the world in which they'd been placed. They were grateful for the managers for giving them educational opportunities, which appeared to just brainwash them. So it's breaking through that, that consciousness. I was there as somebody from the new Lucas plan. So yeah, in the 70s, workers had actually, come up with an alternative plan, but that imagination had been educated out of people at Rolls-Royce and Associates.
Wow. Yeah.
That is powerful.
The
Lyndon.
film now is being toured around the Welsh Valleys as well, so it's used as a talking point. So it people watch the film and then they have debates about this. So it's landing really well, especially with young people.
Yeah, and there is the point about energy, which we might come back to. I want to just bring Lyndon in because I know he had his.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. I really enjoyed the film. I think it's a very important piece of work. I loved some of the interchanges across. I think, Sharon, you used the word intergeneration, but lights coming on, faces smiling, understanding things which have been lost. That's an important part of what was communicated in the film. I wanted to ask a question, though, which I guess kind of comes up with many of these sorts of interventions, if we can use that phrase. What did happen to those two young people? Have they been able to do anything with what various people have called the glimmerings of consciousness? That's one question. The other one I want to ask about is, and it's come up a number of times, and there's a kind of story of the hopelessness of schooling. And why is it that I've forgotten the two names, but they would go through schooling for, I don't know, 11 years or whatever it is, and yet they know nothing about the history beneath their feet, let alone the present above their heads, and the development of wind farms. I was reminded of work that was done in Stoke, where you had a similar issue to do with the rapid loss of the history of minds and communities. And they were preparing something in Stoke and about the history of mines. A little boy sitting in the classroom put his hand up and said, "Please, sir, what's a mine?" And this was in a community that only 20 years before had an active colliery. And there the attempt was made through an extraordinary flowering of working class culture in the Second World War to talk about Lidice, and it's in the context of the rise of racism and all the rest of it, when the Stoke miners, along with the Kent miners, actually through the international solidarity of the miners' unions, when the people of Lidice were murdered by the Nazis, extraordinary outburst of solidarity. And many of the Stoke ordinary folk, ordinary miners, were very central to that. And to be able to tell the story in classrooms about the contributions of maybe even great-grandparents by then, it begins to kind of bring a little glimmer of light and hope that, oh my goodness, I'm learning something. I must go home and talk to my dad and grandpa about this. So I don't think it's all hopeless about schools, or I don't have a complete pessimism, although I do understand the difficulties of curricula and teachers so determined by authorities from on high. I just wonder whether you've got any thoughts about the use of a film like this in schools and how it might be used.
I mean, another key person in the film was the head of history for the sixth form, who appears in the film. So he was shocked that the young people didn't know anything about the town. I mean, they did. They had a kind of. I think it was more to do with the weight of history. It was just another subject along with all the other subjects they were doing, and it was just you know, chatter to them, and also the sense that I think sometimes history, it has to be, you have to start, sort of person centered, like about your grandparents and your life. I think if you just learn this objective sense of this is history and this is the kind of stuff you're going to learn, it's always personalized. And I think it's the personalization of history that makes this so powerful, and he learned as well, the kind of history teacher who said, oh my God, I'm doing something wrong. We've all been swept along by syllabus and and teaching to task. But I think yeah, and also another thing we encountered was all these kind of heritage sites around Wales
Yeah.
that do this kind of state embalming of history.
Hmm.
And I think it's got to be oral history. It has to be people meeting somehow. I just think we met a bunch of people who said, we're trying to raise some more money to kind of, and we went to 3 or 4 mining heritage sites, and there's just like the one in Mansfield, and my granddad's poetry was, and it's kind of, it's not really alive, and we can see what's happened. I mean, in Bolsover, we used to, when me and you, like play our brass instruments and follow the kind of, the Union banner through the street. As soon as that was gone, I don't know. I think the challenge is to how to make that history alive, and I think it's about, always updating what class means. I think that's the problem. I think once you embalm the word class, with whippets and pigeon sheds, you've lost the opportunity. And I think that's where Farage and his cronies step in.
Yeah, right. And I think that goes back to a lot of what Nick was saying earlier as well. Nick, can I bring you in, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Hi, Jeremy.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah, one of I don't know whether you're there, but something I was trying to draw out from the work with Cwmni Bro is how adult learning can be a kind of, or perhaps needs to be seen as a sort of a medium of not just adult learning, but renewal as well, kind of progressive renewal in a broader sense. And this is a point that also relates to some of the frustrations of having gone through like the previous sort of wave of left politics that ended in 2019, and then now we have a new wave potentially, coming in, and with the Green Party and with the possible founding of your party. That looks a bit precarious, but
Whose party? That's right, yeah.
so I was wondering, because I know you've been involved in some of those left party projects, and I wondered, and Ian raised the point earlier about do we need, bigger organizations or institutions if this is going to be supported? Can we rely on the grassroots to do this, to be able to do this on its own? Can we rely on community development as an engine of renewal, or do we need a bigger institution or a left party, basically? I was just wondering if you see any sign of your work with these left parties, because of them seeing the potential of, community development and adult learning, those sorts of things, in terms of part of that process, because, it seems very clear to many of us, I imagine, that it needs to be. And even on a very practical level, unless you involve people on the ground, where are your representatives in communities that are going to get elected going to come from? They're not. You can't just pick them from Westminster to stand, which is part of the failed status quo. So I just wondered if you saw any signs of learning, adult learning, going on in these these left political parties at the moment, because one of the real failures of the last wave was that didn't happen, that democratization, and that kind of moving away from a very hierarchical model of of organisation just didn't happen. There might have been some will for it, but it just didn't happen in reality. And so in this new wave, do you think there's any more openness to that?
Well, interestingly, so obviously there was the initiative by the Labour Party back in 2017, 2018 for the community organising thing, of which Zara Sultana was a community organiser.
Yeah.
I met her when she was probably 17, 18, 19, and she was a total fangirl of Jeremy,
Yeah.
And I think part of this friction has come out from Zara developing her own views on things, and Jeremy, like the whole your party, sort of schism. But yeah, I mean, that was in 2017, 2018. It was too little too late. It was kind of catch up, and I mean, Sharon's seen the kind of community organizing model. It was weird, and it was very bolted on and kind of, even though it wasn't supposed to be, it was still a bit parachuted in. Here's a community organizer to kind of, it's a challenge,
Yeah.
how we I mean, I think it's so important to think about it, but I don't think there's an easy fix. For years and years of neglect of working class history, and the fact that there's no kind of academic institutions attached to the working classes, that could preserve any of this stuff, or keep it alive, or fight the battle and to keep it relevant. Yeah, I'm glad that the word, that the Green Party are talking about class. They made the last film for Zach Clancy, the one on the beach with the boats film. I don't know if anyone saw that. Yeah, so this idea of, but I think at the minute they're all sort of in a state of high anxiety, with Farage and the right wing, and they're just thinking short term rather than long term. But yeah, these kind of, and again with the whole Corbyn project as well, I just think it was all a bit reactive, and responding to massive crises, all the time. So it never really found its settled enough to kind of think about long-term visions of educating, and which is sad.
Maybe it's something we could make a film about, Jeremy.
Maybe so. I think yeah, I mean,
I think we should. The more I think about this, the more important it feels. Yeah.
the whole, yeah, it's we exist despite them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these kinds of
Thank you.
spaces, much as they are, as small as they are in some ways, are really influential, I think, where we talk to one another. I think this goes back to that whole point about conversation, sharing stories, remembering, willful remembering, going back to an earlier comment that I was making, and that whole point about people needing to be involved in the process that Nick's just made, which supports Jez's points.
It's also about imagination as well.
Yes.
It's about what happened, and I think in the film was, it's about obviously it's external, but it's also this internal cracking open of there's honeypots in the imagination.
Yeah.
So just so one interesting, the social entrepreneur came along to a meeting in the church in Methodistville, and tried to talk about community-owned wind farming, and everyone said, "Oh, shut bloody up, we're not interested in that." And then we showed the film, and then he had a conversation again with the same people, and it was like a complete shift in what's possible. So that's what the film is being used for now. It's not just about greenwashing or green energy or community-owned energy or the history of the past. It's about
consciousness,
communities being able to talk about themselves, and to crack open consciousness, because I mean it's I mean, Marx didn't use the word accidentally. It's a change of consciousness, interior process,
creative as well as cultural.
It's creative and it's visionary.
Absolutely. CILLA.
Oh, you've got your mic off.
Yeah. You,
Sorry, just to support that comment, I know I've already spoken once, but just to draw back on what we've been talking about as well is, that's why intersectional listening is so important. It's why interdisciplinarity is so important for imaginations. I'm putting an S on the end deliberately. It's problematic, messy. Everyone has a different imaginative result, but to stimulate that, to get to people to think about what is or can be possible, which is informed from a much wider democracy than your own experience. It's just so critical. It makes it, I'm going using my word twice, I've used the word process today, but it is about process somehow, and learning how to work through that process together is the collectively is the thing to do. Otherwise, you haven't got that sustainable radical approach. Otherwise, you then just lose. Things are go with the wind, don't they? We need to make sure we've got a genuine alternative of the type that Marx envisaged and others. So that we really are talking about challenging patterns of power in a meaningful way.
Another thought I had as well about consciousness was about that children are born into places, and they're very accepting of whatever they're born into. And I think there's a becoming conscious of unconsciousness is actually knowing your history.
Mhm.
And you're in your grandparents, your extended, your community. I think so. History and consciousness. I think you can stay unconscious your whole life, but what happened in the film was these people became conscious, but it wasn't an inner consciousness. It was consciousness of the things around them, the streets, the kind of, that old mine shaft, I don't know, but it's an interesting thought.
And that's central to what I'd say adult education at its best is really about. That kind of learning from history, from others collectively, and reflecting consciously on where you are and why you're there.
And again, it's the clay seeing the kiln.
Yeah, absolutely. The boundaries that you place within.
How you were baked,
Yeah.
how you were made, and then suddenly think, oh shit.
Yeah, I don't want to be this particular pot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to escape the kill. Ian.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating. And just to endorse, I put in the chat thread, and when Sharon first circulated your film, Jez, I mean, I watched it and it's wonderful, and I endorse all that Colin said earlier. And I wanted to kind of make a link, if that's okay, and ask Colin about that film with those other young people in Cardiff, and your sense of the similarities and differences. Because am I right that some of the young people in that film in Cardiff were from Welsh Somali backgrounds, so a very different background? But I thought that there were. That said, it seemed to me that there were also some similarities, and I wonder, Colin, whether you'd got kind of reflections on those two pieces of filmmaking.
That was in a way part of the point of making Culture is Ordinary, with the help of the Raymond Williams Foundation, I may say, that we could put in contact three very different groups, not only the one in Blaenau and the one in the Bay, Bute Town in Cardiff, but also a group from the Rhondda, that they could see that by linking the three groups together, that they could see a shared frustration, shared hope, and make those connections that we were able to make through making the film that connected all three of them.
And just the last little question linked to that, did they meet together, or was there a connections between each of the groups?
Only at the screening.
Oh, okay.
They hadn't, but I mean, I do think that there are possibilities of maintaining now through the medium we're using now to make those connections directly, I think, within Wales. But that's a different a different agenda, really. I think in Wales there is just a very strong sense of community, and especially now in a resistance to reform, who look alarmingly like doing very well in the Senate election next year. And that has, I think, created a sense of alarm and despondency about that, but also a sense of we must work together, pull together for these different communities, different linguistic communities, but different communities throughout Wales to form a collective resistance to what reform is preaching.
No, that's fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. I think, yeah, I just want to say it's been an absolutely brilliant session today from my perspective, and I want to thank Jez as well for that fabulous insight into the making of the film. It's brought out so many of the threads that Colin's just mentioned, but also that we've talked about throughout the chat and through the two presentations from Nick and from CILLA. It just feels so coherent and so much, I think, about a kind of shared vision that we maintain here in these spaces, as well as trying to continue that kind of network building that we've been trying to do. So I know we've only got a few minutes left, and I don't know what Ian wants to do, but I did just want to make a few points about kind of the possible future events. So we had talked about, because we felt, obviously we've had events focused on place and the arts this year in the broadest sense, and this whole idea of consciousness and governance and connection that we've maintained throughout all the research circle events since 2021. But I wonder what people think about a third event potentially this year. It would be at the end of this year, where we bring some kind of collective thinking together. I noticed lots of people in the chat talking about their own areas and about whether we could develop that into a third event, which looks at some of the learning that Lyndon talked about so brilliantly at the Stoke event in May, and the event and the excellent contributions today around relating to Wales. And if we could expand and develop that and bring in some place-based kind of connections from other parts of the country. And it's not really a question that people have to answer now, of course, but it is just a suggestion. It is something we have been reflecting on, and Ian has circulated in one of the previous emails to everyone. Are we interested in a third event? Do people have suggestions and ideas about A, locations or focus, and B, how we might develop that as we have done today? Lyndon.
I don't know if anybody else wants to. It's just, I mean, like you, I feel this has been an inspiring session, and I'm still trying to process certain things. It may involve more than people in the groups from Stoke and Wales, but I think trying to identify some of the key questions from today and trying to bring people together in dialogue in a kind of adult learning sense would be a good way forward. I'm thinking there's so many questions today. How do you get from, as it were, the micro or mezza level to the macro level? How do you build a new politics, for instance? That I mean, someone mentioned just a moment ago about the pressure from reform, and are we going to make all the old mistakes all over again because of the pressure of time? Is there a problem in the kind of struggle for consciousness, the long revolution that Raymond talked about, because it takes so bloody long, and so bloody long isn't necessarily available to us? And that's another question. I certainly would want to encourage us to think further about the issue of getting people to listen one to another, and if we can model that in a way in the third session, that would be very good. I do think the business of listening is easily said, but the practice can be quite different. So for me, there's a whole host of questions which we could build on. Above all, I think it came in the Occupy movement to some extent, which didn't end well, but it was evident there that when people feel, oh my God, what they're talking about in Wales, in North Wales, or in Jez's film, are the sorts of issues that bother me too. I would like to talk further with the people in Wales, and the people in Wales are saying, God Almighty, and the image of the pot keeps on coming to mind, and things, you mentioned at the pot bank and things baked so hard, and trying to bring that metaphor alive so we can talk about the people of Stoke and talk the people of Wales, etc. Somehow the whole becomes more than the sum of the parts. In a way, it's an answer to my question. It may not be quick enough, but how you build solidarity from the particular seems to be a big issue that we need to spend time wrestling with. So I hope we do have this sense of meeting together across these different communities or places and try to work in a very dialogical, listening way.
I think that's a really great point, and I absolutely, if other people agree, I know we can't always guarantee everyone who's here today is going to come to our next event. We've had some ebb and flow, but we've had some continuity as well, and people have supported most of the events. So, and I just wanted to mention something that John Holford and I both experienced. We went to Lisa Mackenzie's play a couple of weeks ago in my case in Selston, and in John's case in Hucknall. It was just an incredible powerful play called 16, which was about being 16 during the miners' strike. And it wasn't about the miners' strike per se, it was about the experience of being alive in that moment. Culture is ordinary. And it was very much about I think the lived experience of being in that moment. And it was highly relevant, a point that Jez made that I think is really vital if we're actually going to build on history and have history be relevant and valuable as a learning experience, but also as a sharing experience, sharing of stories. And it felt quite visceral and powerful. I just thought I'd share that because there's something there about meaning making again through, in that case, the form of plays, the form of a very powerful play, but through a personal perspective that brought in a collective experience. So it brought so many of those elements that we've been talking about together. So I think a kind of shared experience. I'd be delighted to try and bring in an East Midlands perspective myself, and I'm sure there are others here who could do that. So it would be great, I think, to have a shared third event and think more about how we counter these kind of cultural messages that Nick was talking about in relation to Farage. The last thing I wanted to say, just from my end, is I start my project next week. I'm slightly scared, funded by the Leverhulme Fellowship, which is called Lost Places and Untold Stories, the Vanishing World of Experimental Adult Education. And to my great joy, I have a whole year to research that issue and theme across the country. I don't know what I'm going to do quite yet because I've been bogged down in hideous ethical considerations, as you might imagine, because this is not going to be anonymized. But one of my objectives is to create a virtual archive, and it will be an archive that I hope that remains substantial and relevant. And I'm interested in people's stories, but I'm also interested in these lost spaces, and I'm interested in colleagues here who have stories. And but more to the point, I want to try and create some kind of film out of that. It is something I've tried to tap Jez up about, and I'm sure he's expressed some interest in supporting me. But I was just mindful of what Nick said as well. This is such a massively powerful medium. Even these kinds of video exchanges that we're having through Zoom are incredibly powerful. So just wanted to say that feels a tiny bit optimistic, even if it only feels very optimistic for me right now. I'm hoping that's a resource that we can start to build, and the research circle's pretty central to that for me. So just a huge thank you, and I hope people will get in touch with us. Ian.
I mean, I don't want to make any new points, Sharon, but just to say that I think we provisionally arranged a date for a follow-up meeting. But I think we can send a message out to people next week, and that will be an invitation for others who may want to join us in helping to shape the next events. And if people are not able to make the event, which hopefully, a meeting, which hopefully you would, but if you can't, I think to get ideas and suggestions, so I think Sharon's idea around the East Midlands, for me, kind of connects to Colin's example, which I know others have shared about the situation in Wales with the Senedd elections, where you've got in England, where in different parts of England now, with Reform running those county councils. So, that pushing back and that resistance to that, and that's been felt in different parts of England, certainly. So I think for me, that's something we should definitely be meeting and thinking about as one of the challenges that we meet. And there's that connection then between the local that CILLA, Nick and Jez shared, and what we do next. I think that all of these kind of link together. So Sharon, is the best thing that we do is to circulate a note to people at the beginning of next week with that date?
Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
the best thing to do?
Yeah, and I any suggestions for people we might engage with? I've noticed Ian Hewitt's just mentioned Hope Not Hate for the East Midlands element. And I'd be delighted to perhaps ask Lisa as well if she'd be willing to pitch in and engage with us as well, given her recent play. There are various suggestions, but I just think that vital connection between the arts and locality and story is kind of what we're trying to do here. And that vital thread around consciousness and our own agency and governance, which Nick so eloquently identified and is so clear in CILLA's experience and in Jez's brilliant film. So I just want to thank everybody for a fantastic session today. I hope you agree. I think it's been just one of the best we've done. I've loved it, every minute of it. And I'll make sure that this recording, I don't know how well I've recorded it, but I'm hoping it's all right. Not too bad this time. And we'll get it. The recording, as you know, I think I said right at the start, we record all our research circle events and they all go on the Raymond Williams Foundation YouTube site once Bob Foster's worked his magic on them. So I'm just going to ask him quite quickly to get that up there. But we'll send it out to people who've attended as quickly as possible as well. And any slides, so CILLA's slides, for instance, I'll definitely circulate those as well. Thank you so much, everybody. And it's been an absolute pleasure today. And thank you for coming in, and to many of you for staying for the whole session as well, which has been a long one today. Thank you.